I'm personally very excited for our next presenter. Um, for someone who works on the Persian Gulf, including Qatar, there's very few of us out there. So when we spot another one of our kind, we want to smell them out. And so I first became aware of Natasha back in, I think, 2017 or 18, when she had this lovely article. I'll send you the citation later, on laborers in Qatar. And as you'll see, she's been doing some ongoing work on that since then. So I'm really excited to have her, even though I don't know if she's going to address anything about Qatar today. But anyway, I'm very excited. Her work is great. I highly recommend you checking out this article. As I said, I'll send you the citation. Skill and bodies of male workers in Qatar. It's great. So in any case, let me welcome Natasha Iskander, who's an associate professor of urban planning and public policy at NYU's Wagner School of Public Service. Her research focuses on worker migration, skill and knowledge flows, and policy innovation. She's currently completing a book entitled Skill and Bondage, Migrant Workers in Qatar and in a Warming World. Her previous book, Creative State, 40 Years of Migration and Development Policy in Morocco and Mexico, looked at the ways that migrant workers transform the economic development policies of their countries of origin. And of course, you had 2 chapters from that to read for today. She's published widely on questions of immigration, skill, economic development, and worker rights, with more than 30 articles and book chapters on these topics, one of which I already alluded to. Her work has been funded by organizations such as the National Science Foundation, the MacArthur Foundation, the Sloan Foundation, and the Qatar National Research Foundation. Iskander holds a BA in Cultural Studies from Stanford, a Master's in Urban Planning, and a PhD in Management, both from MIT. Please welcome Natasha Iskander.
Hi, everyone. It's so lovely to see your beautiful faces. It is just the highlight to be able to participate in this institute and to really feel like I have the privilege of sharing a few insights with such a dedicated group. It's just made my whole week, and I'm just so excited for this. So thank you so much for zooming in. What I thought I would do is just share some insights related to how COVID is affecting something that people who worry about migration and development think about, namely the relationship between emigration and national development. So I'm going to just share the screen to get the presentation started. Sure. Okay. If you have any clarification questions as we go along, please feel free to just yell them out. I'm happy to be interrupted and to take any questions or comments. Okay, so what I'd like to talk about today is the impact of COVID on remittances, and specifically the impact of COVID on the relationship between migration and development in Latin America and North Africa. Oops. Okay, can everyone hear me okay? I'm going to assume that's a yes. Okay, so this is a story on this slide from the New York Times yesterday, and it addresses the way that the coronavirus pandemic has impacted remittances, has made it much more difficult for migrants to send the money home that they send for family support. So let me talk a little bit about remittances. So remittances, the monies that people send home, are typically small amounts. They are, a few $100s a week, a few $100s a month, depending on where people live and work. And they're monies that people send home for household maintenance and household investments, in particular education and housing. These monies, these small amounts of monies, amount to huge flows of money that have massive impact on the economies that receive them. So this is a map from 2010 looking at some of the directions of remittance flows. So you can see here that the remittance flows end up enacting a really important relationship between nations and economies. Right, you can see here for example, the US, its relationship to Mexico, its relationship to the Philippines, its relationship to China and India is to some extent shaped by the flow of remittances or enacted through the flow of remittances. Okay. As I said, these remittance flows are enormous. I want to give you a sense of how enormous they are. So these are data from the World Bank tracking remittance flows and other financial flows around the world. And you can see that for the last couple of years, remittances have outstripped them all. So I want to just tell you a little bit about what these different flows are. So remittances, here, if you can see the arrow, remittances are 3 times overseas development assistance. So that's any kind of assistance from USAID, the World Bank, the IMF, bilateral economic development assistance. Globally, remittances are 3 or 4 times that amount, depending on the year. They are also larger in some years than foreign direct investment. And they're certainly larger than portfolio debt and equity flows. So the kind of retirement fund investment in different countries. So you can see here that remittances really are a significant amount of money that really transforms the economies that receive them, and that they're a much more significant amount than the amounts of money that we tend to pay attention to when we think about financial transfers in shaping economies and relationships between countries. Okay, so I wanted to give you a sense of how dependent countries are on remittances. The bigger the circle here, the more dependent countries are on the remittances that they receive. So you can see that these circles are everywhere, including in the US, but they are not the same size everywhere. In other words, some countries are much more dependent on remittances than others. For example, you can see here that Central America is heavily dependent on remittances. Haiti, for example, which is this really big circle here, is 35% of its national income comes from remittances. But Mexico is around 8–10% depending on the year. And Morocco, the other country that I'll talk about today, is also around 8–10% depending on the year. Here, Southern Europe is very dependent. And for Peter, who worries about the Gulf, you can see here that Nepal is also heavily dependent on remittances. So the fact that countries are dependent on remittances doesn't necessarily reflect the value of remittances they receive. So the dependence of a country on remittances depends to some extent on the size of its economy vis-a-vis those remittances. So just to give you a sense here, the top remittance receivers in 2019 were India, China, and Mexico. But the top, the countries with the highest dependence on remittances were Tonga, Haiti, and Nepal. So how will the coronavirus pandemic impact these massive flows of money? So again, these are the largest flows of money globally as a category. So just to reframe that, the small transfers of a few $100s per week or month, when added together, they are the largest financial flow in the world. So how will the coronavirus pandemic impact these remittances, and what might that mean for the economies that depend on them? So you can see here that the global remittance drop is projected to be about 20%. So they're projected to drop by about 20% in 2020. The there are some projections about whether they will continue to drop in 2021 or rise, but I think that's too far out to actually make a reliable prediction. The thing to note is that a 20% drop is a really significant shock, especially for countries that depend heavily on remittances. And if you disaggregate kind of by area of the world, you can see that South Asia, which is really India and Nepal, will experience the sharpest drop in remittances. Some of this is due to the fact, or some of these projections are due to the observed fact that during economic crises, immigrant workers tend to bear the brunt of the unemployment shocks. That the unemployment rate for the foreign-born is always significantly higher than the unemployment rate faced by the native-born. So these are some data from years of economic shock, so 2009, but also those shocks persist well beyond. In 2018, when the economies of most big countries of the world were doing pretty well, you still see this significant difference, so that the native-born have unemployment rates roughly double the unemployment rates for native-born. Why? It's worth just taking a second to note why. One is the concentration in service sector jobs. So the service sector tends to be hit pretty hard during economic crises. People cut back on services. A lot of concentration in temporary or gig jobs, a lot of self-employment, and most of all, large numbers of informal jobs, so jobs that are not paid, that are paid under the table and are often very easily, kind of easily evaporate during economic crises. Okay, so what do remittances tell us about relationships between countries? What can they tell us and what don't they tell us? So remittance transfers, as I've said, are a huge expression of the relationship between countries that immigration forges. And they can tell us something about the robustness of that relationship, but they can't always tell us all of the components that go into it. And what they don't tell us an explicit story about are the other kinds of transfers that follow the same relationships that kind of cause or propel remittance transfers. So transfers of knowledge, transfers of political networks. Some of you may have observed or seen all of the politicians from the DR, from Mexico, from Haiti that have campaigned in New York, right? So the political connections, social connections between people, cultural production, but also even more importantly, perhaps, and even less tangible, new aspirations and practices for people, for families, and for communities. What I want to focus on today are the practices and aspirations, and what it tells us about how we might think about the impact of COVID on remittances today. So I want to kind of take a quick step back to an example that I featured in my book, because in a way, it's from a different time that can help us understand the kind of shocks that we're experiencing today. The impetus behind the book that you read the selections from, for me, was really a curiosity about how these practices and aspirations shape the relationship between migration and the economic development and social transformation of the places people leave. So I was really concerned with how migrants shape development and how they might do so through ways that were non-monetary, through practices, through transfers that were not just the few $100 a week or month that people transferred home. And the role of policy in amplifying these dynamics to create development. And in particular, I was interested in this because after 9/11, for the first time, really in the previous decades before 9/11, the transfers of money were being documented as a kind of security move. So all of a sudden, in like 2005, 2008, people were paying attention to these huge transfers of remittances, and they were trying to understand what it meant. And as people around the world were trying to understand, okay, what do these huge transfers of remittances mean, and what might they mean for economic development, a lot of organizations around the world and governments around the world, so think the UN, the World Bank, and also national governments, were really keen to figure out how do we actually support the link between migration and development, and more explicitly, how do we channel these huge money flows that are like 10, 15, 20, even 30% of our national income into development so that we can actually generate economic growth. As these organizations were looking around the world, they found that there are a few countries that actually had long-standing migration and development policies. The Philippines, Turkey, Malaysia, Mexico, Morocco, Italy, Portugal, which used to be, you know, countries of important outmigration. And so countries around the world started copying these policies, and they said, okay, let's just take the policies from Mexico, from Morocco, from the Philippines, from Portugal, and just apply them to our countries. And it just didn't work. Didn't work. These policies fell flat. They were counterproductive. They were oftentimes also harmful. So I wanted to move beyond this best practice approach and think about, well, what were the processes of policy design? How did countries that had developed these policies actually begin to understand the role of financial transfers in development, but more importantly, the non-monetary transfers that often accompanied these financial transfers? And so I decided to look at Mexico and Morocco. They were both border countries. They had similar migration histories. They had similar proportions of their national income coming from remittances. And they also had just an amazing array of really innovative policies. So just to give you a sense, innovative financial tools for migrants with access to a banking system. At one point, Morocco's banking system was 25% migrant deposits. So 25% of the money in its banking system came from migrants. Programs for infrastructure design and funding, local planning processes that were just immensely collaborative, expanded consular services. So for example, Mexico has the largest and most robust consular service in the world. And it provides all sorts of services from legal support to mental health screening to cultural activities to financial consultation. And you can see them in all areas of the US, even in places where there isn't a physical consulate through what the Mexican government calls consulmóviles, which are vans that the Mexican consular system drives to isolated areas, and they set up a pop-up consulate that offers all of the consular services and more, including blood pressure screening, diabetes screening, pop-up cultural events, transit assistance, so helping people cross borders, cultural language and religious education, political representation for migrants and their communities. The consular services of both countries have been really active in helping people access the rights that they do have and making political claims when they have rights in the country of destination to do so, and entrepreneurship support. So in looking at this array of policies, there are two common policy traits. One, these policies were incredibly innovative. They didn't look like anything else out there. They were just like, wow, models of excellence. And they were really innovative in the ways that they used the resources generated by migration, both financial and non-financial, and they were incredibly participatory. And the second was that they were immensely responsive. So they were always evolving, always growing, always stretching. and always exploring new ways to engage in the practice of social and economic development. And as a result, they propelled the state governments into new functions, new territories, and new definitions of development. So just to give you a sense, a little bit of what I did, I spent 2.5 years going around Mexico and Morocco, observing these policies in action. I also spent a significant time in the US and European areas where these policies were linked to. So Chicago, Philadelphia, LA, and Paris, Brussels, etc. And I did something which I call institutional archaeology, which is I took these really well-functioning policies as they existed when I observed them and traced them back to see how they came to be so that I could understand a little bit about the process of policy design that led to these enormously creative policy outcomes. Okay, so what I found. So I had gone into this process thinking that I would discover that these processes were intentional and that they were driven by a desire to link national economic development with immigration and a really kind of positive, forward-looking, hopeful view of the world. And what I found instead was that these policies were not designed to link migration and development at all. And in fact, they were designed as tools to respond to domestic political challenges, and in particular, to control migrants and their families politically. And that the policy outcomes that were so positive and helpful were completely unforeseen and unintentional, and that if they had been foreseen, the governments that led to their creation would have completely blocked them, would have completely undermined them, would have never allowed them to come to be. So these are the photos of the presidents who were in office when these programs began their initial creation. Okay, so what happened? How did countries create these incredibly innovative policies when they had no desire to do so? So both Mexico and Morocco had their kind of phases of heaviest immigration that began around 1964 and 1965. And this massive migration transformed both countries. It transformed them kind of nationally, and it transformed the communities that people left in really significant ways. And state actors engaged with migrants to try and make sense of these changes and to control these changes that were transforming the countries that people were leaving. Right? So for both countries, just to put this in perspective, Mexico and Morocco, about 10% of their population crossed the border. So these governments were trying to control this huge phenomenon and trying to determine what it would mean. And migrants and their communities also engaged with the state because they had new needs and they needed the state to help them address these new needs. So just to give you a sense of some of the dynamics, in the 1960s, when at the end of the Bracero program, which ironically led to an increase in Mexican immigration, it was also a time of a lot of civil rights activism, and the Chicano movement in particular, which really got migrant communities thinking about their rights in Mexico, their rights, the rights of their children, how to transform their communities. And in Morocco, migrants were going to work on production lines in France and Germany and the Netherlands. And in the 60s, it was a period of intense social mobilization and labor mobilization, 60s and 70s for both countries. And governments really tried to control that because they didn't want it spilling back across their borders. So how did these policies come to be? As the state tried to control migrants and migrants tried to get the state to pay attention to them, they engaged in a kind of interpretive exchange where they were trying to interpret these massive social and economic changes for different reasons, but they engaged with one another to try and make sense of what was going on. And as they did that, they created new meanings that created the foundation of new policies. And this was a collaboratively generated resource. So I know this sounds a little bit abstract. I'm going to try and make it concrete in just a second. To make it concrete, I want to show you this example that, which was the chapter that I offered as a reading for this session. The transformation that I'd like to talk about today is located in the Moroccan Sousse, which is in the south of Morocco. These are some photos that I took. It's an absolutely gorgeous area filled with almond blossoms. It's like culturally incredibly rich, but it is in a rugged terrain, and for much of Morocco's history was extremely poor. Okay. What I want to tell you the story about today is how migrant involvement in the Sousse, this migrant engagement with the state in and around the Sousse, led to major reform in infrastructure provision, electricity provision, water, potable sewage, roads, schools, enterprise development. It led to massive changes in these areas. And, you know, there's a narrative in the field of development about how remittances are, you know, they're poverty alleviation tools, but they're small and they can't make big changes. And migrants can't make big changes. But when you looked at some of the reforms that this engagement produced, it led to the reform of 3 national programs and government implementing agencies with total yearly budgets totaling several $billions. So migrant involvement in this area transformed government provision of services in a massive way. All right, so let me tell you the story of how. So the area that I showed you is actually this area here, this shaded pink area of Morocco. So this is Morocco. This area, sorry, this is the shaded area, and the story that we're going to talk about today is actually in the province of Taroudant. This area was for many, many years, starting with the colonial government, described as the useless Morocco. And it was described that way in government documents. So Moroccan government documents in the 50s, 60s, 70s, even into the 80s and 90s described this area as the useless Morocco, and government efforts and investment was directed here on the littoral areas of Morocco, Tangier, Rabat, Casablanca, and this area was completely neglected. So in the 1960s, when migration really started from Morocco and when recruiters were coming from Europe to find men, particularly, to staff their production lines in factories, the Moroccan government directed recruiters to the south of Morocco, in large part because the government viewed this as a restive region. It was a region that had fought very bravely during the independence struggle, and there were rumblings in the 1960s. So Morocco won its independence in 1957. There were rumblings that the area would rise up again because it was neglected by the new authoritarian government. Right, like this was a targeted policy to export a political problem. And in the 1960s, 70% of migrants to Europe were from this region. It continued throughout the 70s and 80s. And it was so extreme that scholars and researchers, and even some government agencies looking at this area said this is an area that is at risk of serious depopulation. The area suffered extreme poverty, and it was a poverty that was highly gendered. So with 85% of women, even in 1990, illiterate. So let me talk specifically about rural electricity, which I want to talk about, use as a way to illustrate this story today. So in the Sousse, in this area of, sorry, actually this is for all of Morocco. In the 1980s, Morocco had a rate of rural electricity coverage that was estimated between 4 and 18%. So I tell my students that whenever you see a span of data that's that broad, it means that no one cared enough about the problem to even get the data right. So between 4 and 18% of households in rural Morocco had electricity. In the 1990s, it was up to about 21%. The estimate was that the government was providing electricity to about 70 villages per year, and that at that rate, it would take 300 years for national coverage. The Moroccan government said, well, you know, the terrain is difficult, we're a poor country, these are isolated areas. But Tunisia and Algeria, that had roughly the same income and roughly the same terrain, had rural electricity coverage that was significantly higher. And when the World Bank intervened to help Morocco develop its rural electricity coverage, this actually led to a decline in coverage rates. When I interviewed the director of the National Office of Electricity, he just flat out told me, actually between 1960 to 1990, electricity was not a priority. Rural electricity was not a priority. So that's the backdrop for the story of the migrants. During this time, migrants from the Sousse were involved in labor struggles in an industrial sector in the south of France. That industrial sector, for a variety of different reasons, suffered massive layoffs. And the government, because it has nationalized many of the factories in this region, gave workers severance packages, but did not give its North African workers severance packages. And so migrants with the unions that they had worked with sued, and they won their severance packages. And the migrants in this legal suit, who were mostly from the Sousse area of Morocco, said, well, let's see if we can use this money to invest in our villages of origin and, you know, go back and we can breathe life back into our villages. We'll set up a corner store. We'll set up an agricultural processing outfit. We will create industry in our villages. And so they set up an organization which they called Return and Development. And they went to go and try to set up these small firms, these small agro industries in their villages of origin. And they found it to be completely impossible because the basic infrastructure to do that was not there. And so they said, okay, it's not going to work. We can't go back. We're going to instead rename our organization and call it Migration and Development. And they said, okay, so where do we start? How do we actually transform our communities so that they become a place where you can actually have some economic activity? And they went back home and they started talking with people, and they started just, you know, talking with people, talking with their uncles and their aunts and their cousins and their wives. And right, they just started talking with people about what are the main issues that we're facing. And they came up with a rough list, the first of which was overgrazing and deforestation. So this region was not as deforested as this. Actually, it looks, when it's healthy, it looks a lot more like this picture here. But it had been overgrazed, deforested. There was an immense shortage of water with desertification in the land around them in this agricultural area. And a lot of it had to do with the disrepair of the steps that communities traditionally had built to contain water and to support vegetation in these mountainous areas. And, you know, they complained about the overuse of wells by some of their neighbors. And in particular, they complained about those people who had motor pumps that were able to draw water from deep underneath the earth, whereas people who were relying on handheld wells found that they had no water and that they were really struggling. And so what they wanted was electricity to allow everyone to have access to motor pumps. So these motor pumps were powered by kerosene that you had to drive up these mountains. It was really expensive. They wanted to have access to electricity so that everybody could have access to water that they could use to cultivate their fields. So the migrants said, okay, let's start with electricity. Through their union in France, they contacted a development agency that worked on electricity. And the development agency said, okay, look, we're going to do a solar panel project, but we just need you to do a community needs assessment for spec design. Designing of how we're going to lay out the panels and the network. And they sent them back with, some kind of clipboards and a survey that they wanted people to do with kind of lots of yes or no questions. And migrants went back to their communities and they dumped the clipboards and they just went and had tea with people. And, they would go to their auntie and they would have tea and they would say, how's my uncle and how's my cousin and how are his studies going? And this is delicious bread. And where did you get the power to cook this bread? Did you use firewood? And my cousin who's studying, how does he see at night? Do you use candles? And my uncle who listens to the radio, how does he get the power for that? And they did this kind of open-ended conversation. What are your aspirations? What would you like to see? What would you like to see my cousin become? Right? So really this sense of a broader conversation about what the community envisioned for itself. And what they discovered was that the problem that they had defined was not actually the problem. The problem wasn't motor pumps, the issue wasn't access to motor pumps, that the issue of electricity was a much more holistic problem, a much more pervasive and general foundational problem. So to just break it down, what they discovered was that the power requirements were not for motor pumps, were not for agriculture, but actually household consumption, cooking, lighting, etc., heating. And that for that reason, the solar panel wouldn't work. That households spent a lot of money on energy. So 30% of household incomes went on energy. So that meant that everyone could contribute something. And that most of the energy usage was for cooking. And it was harvested wood. And that the poor were scavenging wood from the nearby hills and leading to rapid deforestation. And so what they wanted to ensure was that everyone should have access to this network regardless of ability to pay. So the connection that they made was the lack of electricity leads to deforestation, leads to no water, right? So leads you to needing a motor pump to take water from deep underneath the earth. And that if that's the case, then electricity was essential for creating ecological balance, and that for it to work, everyone needed to have access, because if only the rich had access, then the poor would still scavenge the wood. It had to be a public good. Okay, so this is what this looked like in practice. Here's the generator, here are the meters, here are the networks, and here is a map of the network that connects every single household to the generator electricity network. To manage this network, the migrants decided to take some of the insights they had developed through their experience labor organizing in France to say, actually, we need something to manage this network, not just to kind of maintain it, but to allow it to become something that's helpful for the community. And what they did was that they reinvented the Jama, which is kind of like a council of elders. And they opened it up to everybody, men, women, young people. Here you can see a couple of young men who previously would have been excluded. And they opened it up so that everybody could make decisions about what to do with this network. And they legally registered this village association using a law that was passed really on kind of the day after independence in 1957. And they did, this was a really, really controversial, kind of provocative action because at the time that they registered the village association formally in the late 1980s, the government of Morocco had completely clamped down on any kind of independent civil society organization. And so when local governments came to crack down on these registered village associations, the villagers said, well, the migrants did it. They're in France. Go talk to them. We're not responsible. But it was a really important way to make this initiative to generate power locally visible to the state. And all right, so in the village association, as they talked about the use of electricity for development, they decided to tax each other on the electricity use so that they could use the revenue for future projects. And what this meant was, so as they had electricity, they could install new drip irrigation systems, right, with the community tax. They funneled it into drip irrigation, which allowed them to cultivate more saffron, which is a crop from the area that has a really high added value. But the people who cultivated the saffron, collected the saffron, and packaged it for export in the corner stores in Europe, right? The corner stores that migrants had opened, the bodegas of France and Belgium and Germany, were women, and they were illiterate. So they had to create schooling for adults. So what this looks like is this, right? So the network creates revenue, which creates revenue for a drip irrigation system, which leads to the cultivation of saffron, and the cultivation and harvesting for export, which leads to informal schooling. As villages around the region saw this village on one hill lit up in the middle of the night, everybody came and said, look, oh my God, it's all lit up. Please bring us electricity too. We want electricity too. So at a time when the government, the national government, central government was providing electricity to 70 villages a year, this tiny little migrant organization was providing electricity or creating the social infrastructure for electricity to 10 villages a year. And it was kind of like an oil stain is what people described. It's spreading through the Sus Valley, like an oil stain of light. And by 2003, MD, Migration et Développement, had created 400 village associations, and they required that they all federate, that they include all villagers, and that everybody should have access to service regardless of ability to pay. So 400 village associations federated into an organization at a time when any kind of civic organization was completely repressed was like an enormously powerful political movement. Okay, so meanwhile, what was the government doing? So meanwhile, as the Sus was being lit up by migrant initiatives, the government was doing very little. It set up this pilot program of decentralized electrification, kind of off the grid solar panel projects, really to some extent as a way to get the World Bank off its back. It was run by the Ministry of Interior, which is, I guess, equivalent to some combination of, right, the FBI and the Department of Justice. I guess it's the most repressive kind of body of government, and it was really designed to use infrastructure as a means to control. But they brought in some of the consultants that had initially worked with migrants, and they began this process. So this is a picture, just a little parentheses, of a pamphlet from that program, which I found in the basement of one of the engineers who had worked on it. It was just like such an unloved program that this was where I found the documentation. Anyway, this program became a way through which the state started exchanging and interpreting with Migration et Développement villages. There were two main vehicles of exchange. As the government set up this program, its consultants said, actually, we know that these other villages have been doing this great stuff. Can you bring them? And let's see if they have lessons for us. The government included them in the first meeting and then threatened them with arrest. So that was the last time that they were involved. But there was some interpretation in practice where the government would set something up in one of its pilot sites, but then wanted to see how it might work in a mature network. So it tried out in the MD villages. The MD villages had things that they were doing technologically that the government picked up and brought to their side. So there was this back and forth that was really based on kind of the technical piece of this. And from that process of interpretation, there was some learning on the government's part. The lessons are basically these four. First, that in order to build a network that works, you have to see what the community needs. You have to assess how they're using electricity and power.
Two different PPs going. I gotta move this.
You have to adapt the technology to the region. It has to be economically feasible, right? It can't be super expensive. But more importantly, and most importantly, it has to rely on a form of social organization. So one of the memos where the government was capturing the lessons that it learned read as follows. Because it depends on the local autonomous organization, decentralized electricity builds an institutional motor to drive other development actions. Local associations, so village associations, are the PPER's choice for this function because they are totally autonomous and legally, judicially well-equipped. So this is the Ministry of Interior that was throwing people in jail and detaining people who were kind of creating any kind of form of civic organization, saying, right, that they need local associations to make rural development and rural infrastructure work. Okay, so how does this become something bigger? For reasons I won't go into today, the National Office of Electricity goes bankrupt and it restructures itself. And part of its restructuring is the decision to launch a rural electrification program, which it had done before with little success. But this time it actually incorporated the lessons that it learned through exchanges with the migrant villages. And it based this program on a detailed needs assessment on technological solutions that were appropriate to villages in these areas, some degree of community management. And what they did was that they took the model that everyone should have access regardless of ability to pay and applied it nationally. So that they asked urban consumers to subsidize rural electricity in the same way that the villages had asked rich villagers to subsidize the poor. And they connected this network to the national grid. But the government was not stupid. What it did also was it created a social development agency, Agence de Développement Social, which used the village association model. It was set up in partnership with the World Bank, and it required all international funding to go through this development association. So this is a government association, right? So remittance funding for development now has to go through the government. Communities have to organize into village associations if they want to get electricity, but they have to federate with the government. In other words, the government tried to bring these village associations under government control, right? Like they understood the political power of these village associations. The upshot is that rural electricity increased dramatically from 21% in 1996 to 88% in 2006 and to 100% within a few years after that, with a new model for electricity provision. So this was not an isolated story. This process of interpretation that the migrants began, they really thought hard about how to bring the state into that process. And they said, you know, we don't want to provide all of these resources. We can't. We just don't have the resource. We don't have the financial wherewithal. But what we do want is to bring the state by the hand and bring it here. We want to effect structural political change. And they did. They did the same process that they did with electricity, with roads, informal schools, potable water, participation in formal participation in local government, which was completely new, and institutionalizing conversations and exchange with the government. And what they did was they said, okay, through these actions, they redefined this area that was called the useless Morocco, and they recharacterized it as the useful Morocco, so that the Sousse became a laboratory for development, and the kind of models for infrastructure provision, for education, for entrepreneurship, for global exchange, and here in this last one, for climate resistant crops, that the models developed there were applied nationally, and it became like this incubator, this really dynamic space for development. And now this is a picture, a more recent picture of the Sousse area that you saw in earlier pictures where it was completely barren. This is closer to what it looks like now. And this area has become known globally as a place that has advanced the idea of interpretation as a resource for development. I focused on the story of Morocco, or one subpart of the story of Morocco today, but I could have told you another story very similar to the one I told you today about Mexico, with migrant development initiatives focusing really on kind of the center south of Mexico, where there's a deep engagement, deep migrant engagement with community development. What I also want to say is that these community initiatives reverberate outward, and they have important impacts on community development in communities in the US, so that, for example, in Los Angeles and Philadelphia, community actions in communities of origin became a network through which people helped each other get jobs, provided mutual aid, and even organized in cities in the US. So these are some of the examples. This is one famous Mexican example of a kind of government program designed to allow migrants to contribute to the infrastructure construction in their communities of origin. And this program has gotten a lot of attention, but the really important thing about this program is not the money or even the infrastructure that gets built, but the kind of social engagement that it allows and the new models of development that it supports. Okay, so what do we think about, how do we understand this now, and what how the coronavirus pandemic might impact migrant contributions now? So as I said, global remittances are projected to drop by 20%. And what I want to argue here is that the likely impact is going to be far greater than just a financial loss. That it might be, for reasons which I'll just talk about in a second, that the impact of the COVID pandemic might be on these non-monetary transfers, and in particular on these non-monetary processes that generate resources, new ways of doing things, new alliances, new models. Those will be impacted by COVID. Okay, so couple of reasons that we see this impact, right? So this is just the unemployment figures suggesting that we're likely to see a drop in remittances. The worldwide border closures that make moving across space incredibly difficult, moving back and forth to communities of origin incredibly difficult. It's unclear how long those border closures will last. But if we take those stories and we look for a second at family remittances to Mexico, we see two really interesting things. The first, so this is March. You can see here that in March, remittances, March of this year, remittances shot up dramatically. So what was happening in March? In March, Mexican migrants in the US were seeing the effects of the pandemic really up close. And we're telling families at home, go buy groceries, go buy toilet paper. This is some money. It's going to be difficult. You'll need it. This is massive job losses, which makes it difficult to send money home. And this recovery here is some of the unemployment benefits that documented migrants receive being transferred home as part of support for family as well. And there's some indication that this remittance trend will either rise or stay the same as people remain committed to their communities despite the obstacles of unemployment and border closures. This is a story that the AP published just a few days ago, which documented how Mexican immigrants were able to send fewer dollars to their hometown. But one of the really interesting subtexts of this story is that Mexican migrants were sending information back home, telling people to get masks, telling people how to social distance, giving them kind of a reality check on what the best understanding of virus transmission was, et cetera, and so forth. So that even in the face of the coronavirus pandemic, you see this really powerful exchange, non-monetary exchange across borders through WhatsApp, but also through really concrete intervention, so that communities of origin in March and April started sewing masks to send to their compadres and comadres in New York to protect themselves from transmission. The same dynamic is something that we can see in Morocco, just to loop back to that, where this exchange is still, this exchange of information, of engagement, of interpretation. How do we think about how to provide care and prevention and virus mitigation through these migration networks is really vibrant in Morocco as well. So to close, I want to say that in reflecting on some of the discussions on immigration in the US, in preparing this talk, I was reminded once again of my discomfort with so many of them, in the sense that we focus very heavily on what immigration brings to the US, and whether or not immigrants bring enough to justify that they should be in the country, and whether they bring enough to justify that we shouldn't detain them in subhuman conditions. And this rhetoric is always framed by the kind of contribution they can make through their skills or through their labor, whether or not they're taking jobs away or generating jobs in the US. And I think beyond the fact that the Trump administration's use of the coronavirus pandemic to essentially end immigration, beyond that, I'm also saddened by the fact that we have used the contributions that migrants make in the US labor market as the only avenue of defense, because migration is this incredibly generative, creative, powerful vehicle for social change, social betterment in the world, in countries of origin and countries of receipt. And that, you know, it's not just who gets to cross the border, but in ending migration, we are ending this incredibly generative, powerful, dignifying process. And I'll end there. These are some resources in case you want to learn more about this particular intersection. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Natasha. That was wonderful. All right, so we're going to go to questions and answers. We have about 30 minutes for that. And as we've been doing them, you can type a question out in the chat if you like. You can send one to me directly in a private message if you'd like to ask anonymously, or you can also, you know, raise your hand and we can unmute you if you'd like to ask that way. So I actually have one question already, Natasha. This is coming from Mustafa Hassan. He thanks you for an excellent and insightful lecture, and he would like you to shed a little bit more light on why the solar energy project didn't work in Morocco.
Sure. So Morocco is now a leader in solar energy production. So it wasn't actually the technology itself, right? So maybe it was a little bit the technology, in that the technology being used in the 1980s and 90s was more rudimentary. But more than that, it was that the government really wasn't interested in making the solar panel technology work. Oh, you're talking about why it didn't work in the villages. It didn't work in the villages because at the time when they were exploring this option, solar panel energy was not cost effective enough or sophisticated enough to provide continuous use of low need electricity use. So for example, if you're going to turn on the radio for a little bit, if you're going to cook for a little bit, right, and you do that in an entire village, it creates an unpredictable need, and that is kind of low range but constant. Whereas with a motor pump, you can wait till the battery is charged and then pump the water and store the water.
Bess, did you have your hand up?
Yes. Hi, Professor Natasha. Thank you so much for this information. It's very rich, and it's great to see that even though countries are so far away from each other, I think like that's been one of the themes, that the connections. And so in like my culture, I know like we really are not open to speaking to government, right? Or even, so was that one of the factors as to why they weren't able to get the data, because they weren't comfortable with speaking to government agencies? So therefore the government just didn't care because they just felt like the people didn't care, but they never thought of it as that. They just weren't comfortable with opening up and letting them know what their needs were. And then once the government became involved, like politically, you're saying they had to have gotten a cut, right? Is that the reason why they put in all these policies in place so they can gain monetarily?
So the two questions. So the first one, the government in Morocco for really for much of its history, post-independence history, was deeply authoritarian, right? And so deeply repressive, and challenging the government was a really dangerous prospect. So engaging with the government, unless you really needed to engage with the government, was not something people were really keen on doing. And setting up a village association and registering it with the government was kind of like poking the bear, you know, like here we are, and you know, we're going to get 400 villages to poke the bear in a network, right? That's a pretty significant provocation. The reason the government ultimately decided to extend rural electricity, right? So it's a really good question. And one of the reasons that they did that was that when they went bankrupt, they didn't want to have to lay off a huge portion of the National Electricity Office for political reasons, especially since that office was contained within the Ministry of Interior. And so they just created these make work jobs, and they never really actually expected it to work, but because they built in these lessons, it worked.
Follow-up question. So
Sure.
So they never hired the engineers of
What they did with that earlier small solar panel project was the engineers knew that these villages had already done, and everybody knew, right? Like they had registered themselves. And so they're like, these villages have already made it work. We want to go see what they're doing so that we can figure out how to make it work in our villages, right? Like, so that we don't have to reinvent the wheel. And so there's this kind of back and forth. And so they just took the lessons, right? Because they were the reasons that these networks were working. So they took the lessons and they said, okay, we're going to try and implement them in our villages. And then from the government villages, the government learned, right? Governments learn, right? And so they learned and they incorporated those lessons then into the larger project.
You refer to them as lessons, but I'm surprised that these ideas weren't patent, right? Because weren't they innovative, were they? Or
I mean, you know, some of them they're innovative, but they're innovative in a political sense, right? That you need to see what the community wants. You need to allow the community to contribute. If you want to spark a process of local development, you need to let the community organize. Or like they're not innovative in the sense that nobody's ever thought about them before, but they're innovative in the sense that they force the government to move beyond this kind of really authoritarian approach to infrastructure.
Gracias.
No.
Our next question comes from Jennifer Dykes. She is thinking about the relationship between the MD and the government. She asks, how has the MD become more directly politically influential? Meaning, do they actively campaign for politicians or show support for government action outside of development policy?
So MD is like this amazing organization that's now known worldwide. And the reason that it has remained influential is that it keeps innovating in the field of development. So just a few years ago, I went to kind of observe some of the responses they were developing to climate change and desertification. And it was just amazing, amazing. They brought in scientists from all over the world, villages from the Sus Valley, but also further south where people were experiencing stronger desertification and were starting to migrate north to the Sus Valley. They brought in members of government. It was this incredibly rich and thoughtful approach to climate change, including some of the village elders to kind of resuscitate ideas around water management that had almost been forgotten. And so, right, like they developed this, they are developing some of the leading cutting edge approaches to agriculture and under conditions of desertification. So, right, MD remains influential not through influencing politicians directly, although, right, the king has come, politicians now come, but because it has achieved a kind of global renown as an organization that does really innovative development work. And it's just really powerful in that way. And for me, one of the best pieces of that story is that, you know, the reason it is so innovative is that these guys they started as labor organizers, right? They started as labor organizers. And they said, that is how you need to think about development. You need to think about development in a way that starts with the people. And it's just really, and just like continuing to move as new development challenges emerge. They also have this really cool project now where they work with at risk, right? Like it's a strange term, youth in France. And they create summer camps for them. So to kind of get them to reconnect with their communities of origin, communities that some of them haven't ever been to before and whose parents maybe haven't even ever been there before. But this kind of sense of like, we are going to be a transnational community in a more permanent way to get to kind of give them a sense of being able to contribute and teaching them some of the, it's like this pedagogy of development, right? That's how they call it. Teaching them some of the community organizing approaches that they've developed in the Sus Valley now, you know, that they brought from France to the Sus Valley and that they're now bringing back to the banlieue of Paris and other places.
Wow, that's amazing. Just to comment on that, I mean, it's such an interesting contrast with the way that we normally think about development, particularly in the Cold War period, which is much more top-down, much more driven by American aid to countries that it had deemed, you know, essential in, you know, hemming in the Soviet Union. Even though it deployed in some places some of the similar methods that, you know, you're seeing here, but the sort of total contrast of like a top-down versus bottom-up approach to development is
well,
you know.
But the really interesting, I mean, there are two interesting things about this story for me is that it's not exactly just bottom up because, right, you know, the migrants were like, we can't do this bottom up. We need to get the state to come join us, and we're going to bring the state by the hand and we're going to get them to participate in this process of interpretation so that they end up thinking it's their idea. We want them to think it's their idea, right? Because the state has the wherewithal to do these big things. But the contrast where I think you're really right, James, is that a lot of the development projects that worry about migrants and migration and remittances, there's a real emphasis on getting migrants to use their remittances for quote unquote productive projects, right? Like, you know, you're spending too much money on your house, food, nutrition, like you need to invest it in a business to make it productive. And it's not what people want to do. It's not really appropriate, and it misses the underlying processes that are so generative and so important.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I take the point that it's not entirely bottom up, but you know, the origin point seems to be somewhere at the top. The next question comes from Deanna Jones. She thanks you a lot. She's been to Morocco and is fascinated by your work, especially since she saw a lot of the infrastructure projects when she was there last summer. The question is, once electricity was established in the villages and reliance on wood decreased, were there efforts to plant trees or reforest the countryside?
Yeah, major efforts to reforest the countryside. There are two really important things that happened when people shifted from away from wood. So end of deforestation, major reforestation projects supported through drip agriculture that was powered by these generators. But also there was a steep decline in eye disease because the women had been baking, cooking in these enclosed areas on these wood fires, and there's a really high incidence of cataracts, a really high incidence of eye disease, and a really high incidence of blindness among women as a result, and that really dramatically changed.
Yeah. So the next question is from Katharina Kempf. She again thanks you for an enlightening presentation. Can you talk about the role of language in the processes you described? In the Moroccan example, she's guessing communities had to use French, Arabic, or Darija, or dialect of Arabic, and perhaps a local dialect in communicating with different actors involved, and issues around literacy in one or more of these languages.
Right. So all of those languages are spoken in these processes. Right? And one of the really lovely things is kind of the translation and valorization in situ that happens through these exchanges. And it was really powerful to see in the informal schooling for adult women, the literacy in Arabic, but also the literacy in Tamazight, Berber languages. Not so much because it was necessarily going to be very useful for the kind of exchanges that women wanted to participate in, economic exchanges, but more out of a sense of cultural pride. And it was really powerful to see that be part of the story. Now, as there are these exchange programs for young people who are coming back, right, in quotation marks, to these villages, they are also learning languages that they have had little contact with before, that maybe they've heard from their grandparents, right? They're learning them not so much to become fluent in them, but more to develop a sense of connection, rootedness, and the villagers are becoming more fluent in French, which has also a kind of opening in the communities.
Fascinating. Terrence Gilhaney has a question. He would like you, if you could, to briefly define interpretive engagement. He's getting some idea about it in terms of problem identification and problem solving practice, but if you could offer something that is a little bit more clear and succinct.
So I would say that the best way to think about it is interpretive engagement is the process by which you answer a question that you can't yet articulate. Right? It is the process through which you try to understand the meanings that the interlocutors are bringing to a specific problem. So to make that concrete, for migrants, it's understanding what the state means by certain things. And for the state, it's trying to understand what migrants are trying to get at, so that the impetus behind it doesn't have to be innocent, right? Like the state tried to understand what migrants were thinking in order to control it. And here I want to just make clear that the control was not innocent, right? So as part of this research, I spent an afternoon in the basement of a labor organization in Paris, where the organization had kept files on people who had been disappeared when they went home for the summer vacation to do some of this work, right? So this is not innocent, but it's like, just like any kind of surveillance or control requires an understanding of what's going on, the same thing from the migrants, that process generates new meanings that allows for new ways of action to emerge as possibilities. And those ways of action actually provided a basis of policy innovation that was really remarkable. And it didn't stop, right? Because as migrants' needs change, they continue to want to interpret and engage with the government, and the government continued to want to control and manage this process of immigration and immigrant activism, right? And so that process continually generated new understandings, new meanings, new ways of engagement, so that you ended up with policies that remained dynamic and innovative as the years went on, even before people started talking about migration and development.
My next question came to me anonymously, and they're asking, would you say that migrant involvement in policy and in policy making in Mexico and Morocco has led to governments to develop more robust consular services, or were those services largely already in place when these movements began?
No, they absolutely the first, to the point where you know, I was interviewing one of the people who had been instrumental in designing or pushing for expanded consular services in Mexico, a Mexican government official. And she told me, you know, these guys, they first came here asking for support. You know, they would come to Los Pinos, to the capital, ask us for support with various needs, and we had no idea who they were. They came and we just dismissed them. And they kept pressing and they kept pressing, and we're like, who are these people? Why do they keep bothering us? And it was through the pressing that this consular network really expanded.
I have
Same
a next
with Morocco.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Next question comes from Fatima Hosseinzadeh. She says that you mentioned that a handful of countries that had long-standing migration and development policies that were at times harmful. Can you explain a little bit more the ways in which these policies are harmful?
So the countries that had long-standing policies, mostly those worked. It was the cut and paste that didn't work, right? So like at one point, the Inter-American Development Bank was really into like cutting and pasting these policies in different Latin American countries. They cut and paste Mexican policies onto Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Haiti, and they just fell flat, mostly because what people were looking at was like the explicit layer, right? Like kind of like this idea of like, can we get people to spend their remittances differently, right? Instead of understanding that people were spending their remittances differently because of all of these underlying processes. And that what mattered was these underlying processes. So what ended up happening was that these policies ended up killing those interpretive processes and community engagement through heavy-handed government directives trying to structure how people spent their money. And it just ended up killing any kind of useful engagement. And that's why it was counterproductive.
The next question comes from Nadia Mohammed. She is asking that, now that the economy has started to recover a bit in the United States because of stimulus, unemployment benefits, and other reasons, has the situation of countries receiving remittances changed? Has it gotten better? Has it gotten worse? What are we seeing?
It's too early to know, right? Like, in a way, like we're in a moment of intense flux. And I think that, you know, in some ways, how the Trump administration manages the COVID pandemic will have significant implications on remittances and these kind of non-monetary exchanges and transfers. I don't know how. I mean, I can't say with certainty how, and anyone who says that they can, I think, is overreaching. But I do think that it's important to pay attention to the fact that remittances are not just money. They are an indicator of all of these underground non-monetary processes that are at least as important.
Mhm. The next question comes from Julia Morales Abud. She, again, thanks you for such a rich presentation on both regions. She's wondering if you can comment on how the wire transfer fees for remittances are being used in both places. Are those funds being used to give back to the communities in terms of services, or are the fees end up getting collected and put to ends elsewhere?
So the fees that are used, that are charged by Western Union and money order and all that stuff, they go to those private companies. They're not really channeled back into development. And in fact, one of the really interesting Moroccan policies was to create a system that bypassed that completely, so that people could, instead of transferring money through Western Union, could deposit money into an account in Paris that their family members in, you know, wherever, in the Sousse, in Taroudant, could draw from. In villages, even when there weren't banks, right, they had these, just like the Consumovis, they had these mobile banks that would drive from village to village so that people could withdraw their money. And what it meant, it did two things. You didn't have to pay any transfer fees, and it allowed the money to stay in the national banking system until people needed it. And so it wasn't under people's mattresses. And that money was reinvested into major development projects. You know, the direct answer to your question is that the global money transfer organizations keep the profits that they do. And really, the only justification for those profits, right, because it costs nothing to transfer money, are the security protocols they have to go through after 9/11 on global money flows.
Wow. I have one more question from Bess Morales. She is asking about your research practice and whether you were experiencing any discrimination while you were conducting research in these areas. Were you treated as an outsider? What was your positionality here?
Right, so it's really interesting. I'm not Moroccan or Mexican. I'm of Egyptian origin, but I speak Arabic and Spanish. It meant that I was kind of an insider-outsider, right? So that I was somebody who is an outsider, not just like a migrant type, but not their migrant type, right? So it allowed for a really interesting generative conversations where they were speaking in-house, but also not in-house, so they could share things that they maybe wouldn't share in-house, but that they wouldn't share outside of the community. Does that make sense? Like this kind of in-between space. It also shaped how I was received in kind of countries of receipt. So in particular in France, where there was like, okay, you're this Arab woman who is coming to the offices of government, what do you want, kind of thing. But it also meant that, you know, when I went to the labor organizations and looked at the files of the disappeared, it was not so stressful, right? But mostly the difficult thing about doing research for this project, and this is particular to Morocco, was that some of these processes were still politically high risk. And there had to be some sensitivity around managing those conversations. So I never tape recorded anything in Morocco because it would have been so incredibly stressful. Whereas in Mexico, you know, I'd come and I would have my little tape recorder and, you know, I would get to the government office and the guy would, you know, take my tape recorder and put his cowboy boots on the table and be like, let me tell you how I designed this policy. Okay, my name is Jose Sampal, whatever, Jose, make sure you spell that correctly. Like it was just a different political setting, right? Like it just, what these policies meant was something that I had to pay attention to. I also ruined like a set of suitcases and I tried to get them, I tried to cash in the warranty and they're like, no, you kind of mistreated this stuff. Like I traveled a lot. I went to the field. You have to be there.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think we have time for one or two more questions. Cheryl Billingsley asks, or she says it's a great presentation. It just shows that when communities band together and get projects done, it can be successful amidst political pressures. She asked, do you think that remittances will continue to decline based on the present trend of the economic situation among migrants?
I don't think remittances will decline. I mean, if they decline, it'll be because of extreme duress. But I think that as soon as people can send money home, they will send money home because remittances are love, right? Like you are supporting the people you care for. And so that's not the same as just any old financial transaction. You know, you're not deciding which investment makes the most sense, you know, this thing or your mother's healthcare, right? Like it's a different calculus. And so I really don't see remittances falling. I see them as continuing to grow. They might fall to specific countries as migration patterns change, right? So one of the reasons that migration from Mexico has been net zero is not just the Trump administration's policy, although it's a little bit, but it's really mostly because the demographic profile of Mexico has changed and there are fewer young people. And so fewer young people to migrate. And that, you know, if there's no migration because of those demographic shifts, eventually you see remittance patterns change, right? So Italy is no longer a major recipient of remittances, but it was for a large part of its history, for example.
Yeah, the fascinating thing about that chart you showed was that each of the other forms of investment, you know, chart more or less with like declines happen when there's a stock market crash, right? You know, after 2008 or after some other kind of crisis, and the remittances seem to not be affected at all, at least, you know, in the aggregate by those kinds of shocks. If you have time for one more, we are at 2:30. I think Beth had a follow-up question to her question from earlier in terms of speaking to government officials. How do you get clearance to speak to them? Do you just show up? Do you introduce yourself before? What's your process like for getting access?
It's a little bit of everything. You know, people introduce you to people. Sometimes you just show up. Sometimes you hang around a lot. I think that research is opportunistic in the sense that you really try and exploit any opening that happens that allows you to connect, and then you try and earn the right to be there once you've connected, right? Like respecting the people, respecting your interlocutors, respecting their needs, and also just really being open to what happens. Peter mentioned that I've done research in Qatar. That was a more difficult set of research circumstances. And I think each circumstance requires that the researcher adjust, but the circumstances or the difficulties of research tell you a lot about the circumstances, right? So the discomfort is also important, where people feel like they don't want to answer a question. That's also important to pay attention to. It can tell you a lot. Or the unbidden confidences, right? So when I was in Mexico, somebody who worked in the Ministry of Foreign Relations, we went to lunch, and for some reason, right, over lunch, he felt moved to tell me about when he had worked in the security services and had been monitoring the wiretaps on all of these highly placed government officials and what that did to his psyche. And right, like these things are unbidden and they come, and you just kind of have to be there for them.
All right, thank you so much, Natasha.
Thank you so much.
Really, really wonderful. I want to give her another round of applause here.
Thank you for listening.